Hi, I'm Maddie,
And I'm Abigail, and this is
two writers,
many submissions.
so many.
So many submissions. So that is what we're talking about today, right?
Yes, talking about the old submission grind.
Oh God, yes. With short stories, you submit poetry, all kinds of stuff. So we're going to talk about how do we find places to submit to, what that process looks like, because I feel like that's a place that a lot of beginning writers start is submitting shorter pieces. You know, very few of us just jump to writing a full novel,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I think too, it's kind of a good way to test the waters and learn about the publishing industry and how that
Hmm.
works, submitting and getting things potentially published and
Yeah.
just kind of getting used to rejection. That was something I wanted to use submissions for was to, I know that rejection is part of the game. So that was like a quick way to learn how to be rejected. And I've gotten a lot of experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that's one of the things that is talked about, but you don't really know until you're in it, is like part of being a writer is learning how to cope with rejection. Um, and I don't want to focus on it too much, but it definitely going through the submitting process, I feel like not only helps thicken your skin, but it also helps you realize that it's not all personal, which is hard because like what we do as an art form is personal. So those rejections feel like a knife to the heart sometimes.
Yes. And I'll definitely dig more into rejection in the future, but I do
Hmm.
think that it's good to mention it because it's part of the game and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
just
Do
something to prepare
you
yourself for if you're starting your submission journey. It will happen and that's okay.
hmm Yeah. Do you remember the first thing you ever submitted to?
Yes, I do.
What was
Uh,
it?
it was so for my fiction 2 class in undergrad, one of
Hmm.
the assignments was that we had to finish a short story and submit it to a magazine just to get ourselves in the process. So we had to prove that we submitted it. And
That's so nice.
she was really, her name was Julie because, it's like
Hmm.
that's how professors
College.
are. And I thought that was such a cool thing. And
Hmm.
I submitted a story. It wasn't quite perfect, which is really hard for me because I'm a perfectionist.
Hmm.
It was done, but it wasn't perfect. And my professor was like, I think you should submit it as is because the full story is there. It doesn't have to be perfect. So I submitted it and it was to Clark's World magazine, which is like top tier for sci-fi writers.
Hmm.
So that was very arrogant,
Ambitious.
ambitious. Yeah. And one of the things is I was actually very afraid that it would get published because I didn't think it was ready. So purposely submitted to Clark's World knowing that they would reject it, and they did.
Oh, well, it all works out, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, that's so funny. So the first thing that I ever submitted to, um, is in high school. My freshman year, my high school had a literary journal that like I always really, really wanted to work for. It was called the Omnibus, but it got disbanded. Like there just wasn't enough interest by the time I was old enough to actually work for it. But I
Mhm.
did submit to it my freshman year. And as we've talked about before, I wrote a lot of melodramatic poetry. And one of my poems got accepted. And then they took a like two-line snippet from a different poem and use that as well. So I was like, my freshman year, I was like, I got published twice. And it's like, kind of,
That's so
not really. Yeah.
cute.
But then I got into undergrad and Florida State has the Kazoo Review. I submitted to that bitch every semester and never got anything but rejection from them. So it was definitely like I don't know, kind of a shock to go from
Yeah,
freshman year, like you get published, and then college, like, no, no, no.
that's pretty cool. Like my high school didn't have anything like that.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Um,
got very lucky with that.
that's pretty cool. I
Well, the
was in
other
the
thing,
school newspaper though.
it's fun. We didn't
So
have a school newspaper.
not in high school, in middle school. I was the main editor and I had stories published. So
Damn, look at you. So that's okay. I was just about to say that's so funny because in my senior year of high school, my teacher submitted one of my nonfiction essays to this like district thing that I got second
Oh,
place for. That's
that's
kind
cool
of
as
my
heck.
my history is getting second place and stuff. Like in college, I submitted to this thing called the Voices of the South, and I got second place. So it's just constant, like almost good enough. But it's
Second
funny that we
place is
both have
good though.
had, yeah, I mean, I think it's funny that we've both had nonfiction pieces published to some
Yeah,
degree,
that is
even though
interesting.
nonfiction is not what we write.
That's true. That's
Yeah,
very true.
yeah, interesting. I don't know. But yeah, I feel like I really started taking submitting seriously when I was trying to get into grad school. Because unlike you, my undergrad education didn't talk about submission. Like I didn't
Mm.
have any reference point for that. So when I was applying to grad schools, I had nothing on my resume to put towards a, creative writing graduate program. So when did you start submitting more seriously or understanding what submission meant?
Probably like I think if I remember correctly, it was like 2018. So probably around the time I started grad school was when I started
Hmm.
taking it more seriously. But I didn't really start taking it seriously until like last year, in which I
Hmm.
was like constantly submitting stuff. But I started submitting stuff because of encouragement from my mentors at my MFA program.
Nice. I love that. How did you go about finding submissions? Because when I started submitting, I was out of my undergrad and trying to get into grad school. So I was really on my own. But you were in the graduate program, yeah?
Yeah.
So how did you start finding places to submit?
Well, I had submitted here and there
Hmm.
before grad school. And
Okay.
mostly it was just I did magazines that I listened to and read. So I read a lot of like Asimov and like Clark's World and stuff like that. And so I submitted to them, but those are like higher tier stuff. And when I got into grad school, I was being told that like that's kind of like top bar for your genre. So maybe you should try looking like for something a little that,
Hmm.
pays a little less just to get your foot in the door. And I never learned that lesson and continue to reach for the stars and then wonder why I'm rejected all the time. But I just right now my I kept submitting to the same places that I was familiar with as a science
Hmm.
fiction writer, but kind of looking into that genre. I use the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Guild of America. They come up with a list every month
That's nice.
with open market, and then I click on it and it leads you to they have links that lead you to, I think, grinder.com
Hmm.
is what it's called, a submission grinder.
Hmm.
Diabolical plots slash
Not to be
submission.
confused with other grinder, just to
Yes,
clarify
yes.
that.
That's why I wanted to. I think it's called diabolical plots slash submission grinder. So it's a
Okay.
submission grinder, not grinder.
Uh-huh.
Very,
Yeah.
very clear. It ha leads to that, which is like an online database of
Hmm.
that kind of gives you information about the different magazines. And so you could look on there and it tells you specifically what subgenres they're looking for, how much they pay, and if they have any like specific stuff that they're looking for. And then I would kind of make a list from there because not all of them would were interested in speculative work. So I would make sure that I got like all the ones that were speculative, all the ones that paid me a guild wage because I wanted my goal is to join the Sci-Fi and Fantasy Writers Guild. So I
Hmm.
need paid at that level in order to be considered when I get published. And that's kind of my strategy was I started there and then I've started recently to branch out to find less premier magazines to publish to. And so a little
Honestly,
haphazard here.
well, okay, you say haphazard, but I really like your approach to this because, like I said, when I started out submitting to stuff, I didn't have anybody to talk to. So I just like Googled where to submit fiction short stories,
Mhm.
with no information, no guidance, no mentorship. And on top of that, I I'm gonna get like blacklisted for saying this. I don't read short stories really. I don't read the literary journal magazines. I know, I should. I buy them.
Girl,
I buy them all the time. And I read them when I was in undergrad, and like I will assign stories as a teacher, but it's not something that I actively seek out in my free time. I enjoy novels. Um, and so I feel really bad about it. And like I started getting better about listening to them. But it's just, especially at the time, it wasn't something I didn't have money to buy the journals at that point. And I didn't have the knowledge to look into all of those things.
Hmm.
So I started submitting to basically just wherever. I eventually found the Poets and Writers website, which has just an overwhelming list of journals, which was great to have that many options. But like, I literally would just submit to the first six and then to the next six and then to the next six. Yes, you are showing me your Poets and Writers magazine right now because you're a good person and you subscribe to all of these things. And I am not a good person.
Just
Um,
lighting my money on fire.
but I made the mistake of because I was so desperate to get into grad school, I just needed something. So the first three pieces that I got like seriously submitted, that to be honest, are the only three pieces I have to my name right now, um, were two journals. Um, that one of them no longer exists. And the other two are just purely online journals. And so they're not reputable by any standard. And then again, I lost one of my favorite stories because that journal went under and no longer exists. You can't even like the website doesn't exist anymore. So that story is just
Gone.
gone.
Yeah.
So I feel like even though you were, reaching for the stars or whatever, once you get published, like that story is going to stick. Whereas my stories feel very, um, I don't know, temporary where they are right now.
Mm.
And like as much as I have a story published in Down on the Dirt magazine. They do like an online journal and then I think a yearly like physical publication. So I do have that physical publication and it is exciting to have and I love the story that's in it. But trying to find that story, like you can even go on my website and like you have to click through six different links to get to my story because the website is so old and so poorly set up that it just feels illegitimate, you know?
Yeah.
So as I've grown in my submission journey, one, I have started reading the journals I'm submitting to, or trying
Yay.
to, at least reading like one story. And then two, trying to find those reputable journals. So one of the ways that I did that was going to AWP with you last year, which again is authors, writers, and poets. And going to that conference and meeting all the journals at the tables in the is it
Book
called
fair.
the book fair?
It's
Okay, that's
called
what
the
I
book
thought.
fair. Hmm.
Okay, yes, thank you. Is the way that I started finding more reputable journals.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard, but I mean, once you find those journals that you want to submit to, the process is pretty much the same for all of them, right?
Yeah. For a lot of them, there are. Since you call that Poets and Writers, and I do get
Hmm.
their magazine. Something that I think is really cool is they have a section in the back of
Hmm.
their magazine that has upcoming deadlines, which is pretty cool.
Oh.
So it's like a list of everything the deadlines that are coming up for
Hmm.
the next 2 months, essentially. And so
I should subscribe to that.
what I was doing was,
Hmm.
and they have really, really cool, good articles in here to read too. But what I started doing is every month, like the first of the month, I would look through deadlines that were upcoming and I would write any ones that were applicable to me or that I'd be interested in submitting to. And
Hmm.
that was kind of how I kept up my submissions so much.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think specifically I started doing that since I was interested in trying to get my poetry published, which I never really
Hmm.
started to do that until very recently,
Hmm.
within the last couple months. And so I had no idea where to submit poetry. That was a completely different thing. So I started using this as a way to find places
Hmm.
for poetry.
Yeah. I'd love to talk about kind of before we get into like the nitty-gritty of how to submit to journals that we found,
Mhm.
the differences between submitting poetry versus submitting short fiction. Because I don't submit poetry, but talking to people in grad school, talking to you, it's a really different process because for short stories, you submit one short story, hopefully to like 4 or 5 journals. Some journals don't take simultaneous submissions. And then that one short story stays in limbo for anywhere from 3 to 6 months until it gets, accepted or rejected. So it's a really slow process because I've been focusing on my novel, I only have 3, maybe 4 short stories that I feel comfortable enough sending out to journals. So there's
Mhm.
only so many places I can submit to in a year's time. But poetry is different from what I understand.
So, I just got a rejection letter like a couple days ago for some poetry I submitted in August.
Oh my gosh. And we are in January.
Right.
hmm
From my experience, it's been just as slow as
hmm
short stories has been. I feel like maybe a little bit faster, but it's still
Do you submit one poem at a
slow.
time or several poems at a time?
So there's different places have different rules. So some are like submit up to 5 pages, or some
hmm
are like submit up to 5 poems.
Oh,
And
okay.
those are different things because
hmm
you could have 5 poems that are 10 pages, but you could have
hmm
2 poems that are or one poem that's 5 pages.
Right.
So you have to pay very close attention to what you're submitting to.
hmm Okay.
Um,
Yeah, because talking to
yeah.
people in grad school, Fred would say like, "Oh yeah, I submitted these 5 poems. They wanted one, but then rejected the other four. So then I
Yes, they
sent
can do
those
that.
4 out on submit, and it kind of is more of a numbers game, it seems."
Yeah, because they encourage you to submit up to 5 so that they can,
hmm
I guess, pick and choose which ones they like if
Okay.
they have so that I think because it's since it's shorter, they're like might as well have
Right.
judge instead of judging one thing, we're judging a bunch of things.
hmm
But again, I just very recently started doing that, and
hmm
most of the places I've submitted my poetry to, other than that one journal,
hmm
have been I submitted to a like via email to a different journal, and it was the same time, so August 31st,
hmm
and I still have not heard back from them, and I don't know if I will. Like I kind of feel like,
Yeah, I have a story out on submission right now that I sent out in May, and they vary. I mean, a lot of these journals will specifically say, if you haven't heard back from us in X number of months, feel free to reach out. And this journal very specifically says, like, do not reach out, we will let you know.
yeah,
Which is scary, because it's just sitting there. And especially if you submit to a journal that does not allow simultaneous submissions,
yeah.
that story is being held hostage, essentially, until it gets accepted or, unfortunately, in my case, most likely rejected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the beginning of like the end of August was when I very first started submitting
hmm
poetry. And I'm very grateful that it's different. It's a different world because the journals I submit to for my short stories, every single one of them is like,
hmm
we do not accept simultaneous submissions.
Oh,
So
wow.
I literally have to wait 6 months before I can submit again. Um,
How many
and I only have
stories do you have going on submission right now?
3.
Okay.
So I don't have a lot. So that's why I started like, oh, maybe I have some poetry I
hmm
like. So let me try and submit
hmm
that around. But
Yeah.
again, I still haven't had that much experience with submitting poetry yet. Had
hmm
like I've submitted maybe like 6 things.
Damn. It's yeah, it's exhausting. And like again, the thing that I think is really interesting is that the mentors we had in grad school, they I'm not going to say all of them, but many of them almost primarily worked in short stories. Like
Mm,
specifically, I'm thinking of Kevin Moffat, who I absolutely adored. He was one of my favorite mentors I ever had. But I mean, his writing was short story collections, and he's been published in McSweeney's, and like that's the most incredible thing to me.
for real.
Um,
Yeah.
but like, I feel like sometimes I feel like submitting, I am treading water when what I really am passionate about is novels. And it's interesting how the two things go together, like writing short stories and writing longer pieces. But I definitely feel like, there is a lot of I don't know, prestige in submitting and like getting accepted into these big short story literary journals, you know?
Hmm.
Yeah. For my blog not too long ago, I was looking up different authors because I had my 31st birthday and was like feeling really old and whatever. So I looked up like, oh, when did all these authors get started? All of them were like 27, but Celeste Ng, who wrote Everything I Never Told You, and Little Fires Everywhere and so on, I was like, oh, she didn't get published until she was like, 37. And then I looked up her history. This woman had so many like prestigious short stories in journals. It's almost like a separate career path, you
Hmm.
know? It's crazy. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely looked that up, people that I really admire, and
Hmm.
it's always like, oh, you're so much younger than me, and you've accomplished so much more.
Hmm.
Cool,
Yeah.
cool. That made
Yeah.
me feel great.
Great.
Yeah.
Love that. Love that for us. Yeah. But anyway, so that's how we find journals. Submitting is a long process. But I also want to talk about like what are the components to submitting to journals, because that was another thing that when I was starting out by myself, I didn't know what to include in a cover letter. I didn't
Mhm.
know, I mean, I knew how to write one for a job opportunity. But how did you start writing your cover letters for these journal submissions?
So, my mentor in my
Hmm.
graduate program, it was Jessica Anthony. Um, and who I had a really good relationship with her, and
Hmm.
she was like, just send me your cover letter and I'll review it in your packet.
Nice.
And so I sent it to her, and she basically rewrote it, and she's like, this is the cover letter you should be using.
Oh, that's
And
amazing.
it like specifically, she's like, right, my mentors, Jess Anthony and Jason Ocker at I'm working with them at the MFA program,
Oh,
and it hasn't helped. Like, name dropping has not helped, but
yeah.
she said totally fair to like conclude us because we did help mentor you,
Hmm.
and it's okay to call us out in that. And that was something that she had given me to say, and just very, very short. So I had like some details in there. She's like, no, say enclosed is this short story. This is the title. This is the word count. Um, to include that I have an MFA, that's something that's relevant. I have an MFA who I've worked with. And she said also it's good to include, if you've never been published, include that because that this people like to be the person to discover you. So that's a good
Hmm.
thing to include as well.
Do
Oh,
you
go ahead.
still include the mentors' names now, even though we're however many years out of grad school?
Um, Sometimes if I think it might be relevant, but most of the
Hmm.
time I don't because it's been so long since I've worked with them that it
Right.
seems weird to mention. And it just seems like pretentious
Hmm.
to name drop. Like, oh, did you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
I used to know her. Um,
Hmm.
so now I just put that I have an MFA and that
Hmm.
I'm working on my debut novel.
Yes. I always put, that I'm working on my debut. And specifically when I look for journals, I look for ones that say, like, we want to publish new voices.
Yes.
Um, because I always, hope that that will give me a leg up. However, again, has not proved particularly helpful at this point.
I mean,
Um,
same. I also like to
yeah.
submit to places that they judge blind, so they ask not for you
Yes.
not to include your name.
Hmm.
I like that a lot because it
Hmm.
feels more fair, at least.
Same. Well, and that always makes me wonder the relevancy of the cover letter. Is it being read before or after they've read the work?
I
If they're reading blind, because my cover letter, so I set it up in the 3 paragraphs, very, very short paragraphs. But like, the first one is, this is who I am. This is where I got my degree. I teach creative writing, whatever. The second one is brief synopsis, what the story is about. And then the last paragraph is always, I'm submitting to this journal because of X, Y, and Z, and to personalize it of like why I like that journal. But again, if we're being honest, like I don't read all of them. Like I'm telling you, no one's going to publish me after this. I don't read every journal that I submit to. I can't. I'm
Oh
sorry.
my God. Oh my
I
God.
know, I know. You're so disappointed in me. Um, but so a lot of times I'll go to the journal's like about us page and kind of synthesize what they are looking for, or like what they stand for. Because I do research all of the journals. I
Sure.
just don't have time to read what they've most recently published.
So, uh, I do research on the journals that I write for, that
Hmm.
I submitted to. And a lot of them, I read the editor and they're like,
Hmm.
I'm not going to read your cover letter until I accept your story. So
Oh, then
really
what's the
like,
point of writing the cover letters?
so it doesn't, he's like, so they're like, it doesn't matter to me. That, so
Hmm.
I also, unlike you, am not a
Hmm.
liar. So I
Yeah.
don't try and flatter them and say, I really like your magazine. I read it all the time. I
I
don't try
don't
to,
say those things,
oh, okay. What
but
I'm
I
saying,
do.
I don't say I really like this about your magazine because no, I
Hmm.
don't. I'm honestly submitting to your magazine because I read a short story collection and your magazine published this story originally that I really liked. So that's why I put you on my
Hmm.
list. Um,
Hmm. So you've never submitted to a journal that you did not read something from?
I would not say that's true. I've definitely submitted to
Okay.
journals that I've never read.
Okay.
But I try not to. I try
Yeah.
to submit to places that are familiar in at least some way.
Hmm.
Um, I like to read short story collections, so I
Hmm.
always look at where they were originally published, and that kind of helps me like, oh, I really like the story. I see vibes that I relate to in it, so
Hmm.
I'm going to add them to the list of things I
Agreed.
submit
Yes, I definitely do that. And then I'm not gonna say almost the opposite, but like I'll go through poets and writers and find journals that are looking for what I write, and then
to.
I will like buy an issue and read the most recent things. And again, I don't do that every time, but specifically with journals that aren't just online journals because I've been so burned by online only journals.
Yeah.
Just to kind of see the legitimacy of these things. I also look for how long the journal has been around. Like that's one of my new go-tos. Because I don't want to lose another story, you know? Because I can
Hmm.
say I've been published 3 times, but you can't find one of them, so it doesn't really count. Um,
It still counts.
kind of.
It does.
So would you say that cover letters are a high priority, low priority, somewhere in the middle?
I would not stress about your cover letter.
Hmm.
I think if your content is there, if your story is
Hmm.
interesting, if that's what they're looking for, I don't think it's not going to rub them the wrong way.
Hmm.
However, I do have to say, and this is a little bit of a sidebar here. As somebody who was a hiring manager, the very exact opposite is true for cover letters. I found them to be very important, but I also was
Yeah.
hiring writers. But when it comes to the publishing industry, I think it's important that you do include a cover letter and
Hmm.
that because it shows that you're willing to do that extra little step. It's really annoying, but
Hmm.
doing it just shows that you care about it. And taking the time to read through each magazine, because sometimes magazines will be like, hey, this is the type of cover letter I want to see. So
Hmm.
sometimes I'll switch up my cover letter to fit that format. But for the most part, keep it brief. You're already submitting something very long for them to read. That's where your
Hmm.
writing should shine. This should be very professional. This should
Hmm.
acknowledge, like, thank you for your consideration. Here's the information you need to know. So they don't have to like skim through anything. It's kind of like I feel like almost like the writer's equivalent of a resume. Because as a hiring
Hmm.
manager, I would look at a resume and I would just skim.
Yeah.
So it needs to stand out. The stuff I need to know needs to be very evident and clear. Your
Hmm.
cover letter was a chance for me to see that you knew how to write and could communicate effectively, which I think is
Right.
the same thing.
Well, and I also think there's, I want to be sure to clarify for the listeners the difference between a cover letter and a query letter. Because query letters, when you start submitting to agents, incredibly important. Cover
Yes.
letters to submit to journals, much less important, very brief. Like I give the briefest of bios about myself because if they like the work, they will, if like they want to publish it, they will ask for a bio after the fact. So I don't put in a ton about myself other than I have an MFA, debut novel. And then same thing with, talking about the journal itself. I'll just say, I am submitting to you because X and Y, leave out the Z, and just like as brief as possible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, just I would say the cover letter should only include information that is necessary
Hmm.
for the person reading it. So, word count, it's always good to say to include
Yep.
your word count in case, because they want to know how long it is. That's important.
Hmm.
The title,
Hmm.
anything in your credentials that makes you writing the story special. Like this story is like about a technical writer. I have 10 years of
Right.
experience as a technical writer. That'd be a good thing to mention.
Hmm.
If you think your work is similar to another writer they published, I think
Hmm.
that would be good to include. If you think your writing has similar vibes to the magazine's vibes, I think that would also be good to include. But it's gotta mean something. You can't just put a little descriptor in there just for funsies, but just
Hmm.
make sure it has intention. Including a
Exactly.
bio is good. Some places ask that you don't include a bio,
Hmm.
that I've written too. So I just
Oh,
just make,
interesting.
make sure because they're like don't include a bio because they're
Hmm.
not going to read it. But
Right.
if I because if we do submit it, if we do choose it, we will um sorry,
Reach out to you for a bio.
correct. So
Yeah.
it just depends. Make sure you're reading the submission guidelines because they will tell you stuff. If they have very specific requirements for
Hmm.
cover letters, they will tell you. And
Hmm.
they notice, I would say they probably notice that you don't if you're not following directions.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I think is important for cover letters is not just personalizing like why you are submitting to the magazine, but researching the editor's names and addressing the cover letter to that person. And I know it's a small thing that like seems like common sense. But I feel like especially in grad school, people would just write like, "Dear editor." And it's like their name is listed on the masthead. It takes five
Yeah.
seconds to look through a journal. So like having that, looking through the journal's bio, what are they about? What are they looking for? And then reading their submission guidelines really clearly, because the number of times that my short stories are too long, my short stories are typically around 5,000 words, and
Hmm.
there are a lot of journals that are 3,000 or under,
Yes.
which is really hard. I have one short story that I love. It's 8,000 words. Like at that point, I either have to flesh it out into a novella or slaughter it to fit anywhere, you
Slaughter
know?
it.
Slaughter. Yeah.
Slaughter it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do
Um,
definitely want to emphasize
mhm.
read the submission guidelines because
Yes.
there are so many editors who have very specific opinions on things.
Hmm.
I've had a place I submitted to that said, don't address it to anyone in specifically. Just put dear editor.
Oh.
Don't include dear editor at all. Like
Hmm.
just put the cover letter. Don't address it to anyone. It's like, okay. So
Interesting.
again, pay very close attention because some of them have like
Hmm.
they're like, and
Hmm.
it feels like a thing that they're gonna like reject your piece
Hmm.
for because you didn't read their I feel
Right.
like they're putting it there
Hmm.
to like
Just to
see
see if you can
if
follow
you have any questions
directions.
because it seems
Yeah.
so unnatural to not include a salutation.
Hmm.
But I
Yeah.
think that they just want to see if you actually read things.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, so I feel like we talked about submitting to journals a lot, but I also want to talk about submitting to things other than literary journals,
Sure.
because until you, I never even considered submitting to other things to like grow myself as a writer. I didn't even know that writers' conferences were a thing, which again, I feel like I was so naive thinking that writing was just this little tiny bubble that you did by yourself and then eventually somehow miraculously it got shared with the world. And like to learn that there's such a larger writing community out there.
That's wild,
um
huh?
it's wild. So like since I've met you, we obviously went to AWP. Our listeners are going to get so tired of me saying that, but like it's the one cool writer thing I've done. Um, but went to AWP and through that submitted to the Agents to Writers program, which I got rejected for, but we're cool with that. And then we've also both submitted to the Tin House residencies, um, you know, which again, got rejected for, but still. Um, but I feel like I don't know. It's just it's nice to know like there are other avenues to grow your writing. And specifically at UT, Jess Anthony talked so much about writers' residencies because she did a ton of them. Like she told us the story that she went to the Swanee Writers Room like conference
Yeah.
and fucking met Lin-Manuel Miranda. Like what? Um, and so it's just interesting. Um, I don't know, just there's so much more to the writing community and to being a writer than just submitting to literary journals or publishing novels.
Yeah, I do think it's good to try and do opportunities too, or go to conferences. And
Hmm.
they do have other conferences like for like specific genres and sometimes little magazines. There's events that go around. I think it's important because it does kind of help refill your cup because
Hmm.
just doing submission after submission after submission can it's a grind and maybe you get
Hmm.
exhausted from doing that like I did and I'm taking a little sabbatical. But I am
Hmm.
going to AWP
Yeah.
next week and I'm really
Hmm.
excited about it because I think it'll refill my cup and renew my
Yeah.
hope.
Well, and it's such a great outlet for renewing creativity and refilling the cup, but it's also a great opportunity to not feel alone. And I think that especially growing up, you have this narrative of a writer is somebody who sits at their desk 8 hours a day and does this very independent work, you know?
Yes.
And the reality of it is, yes, I write my stories by myself, but the writing community is what allows me to grow as a writer, and to make connections, to share writing.
Hmm.
And I think that those extra opportunities are so critical and so important. And I realized that in grad school, because in grad school was the first time I ever said, like, oh, yeah, I'm a writer. And didn't feel the need to qualify it with, well, I've never
Yeah,
been published, or, well, I'm working on this, or, because everybody there understood.
100%.
And
Yeah.
yeah. And I felt the same way at AWP of all of us are there for a common hope and a common goal. And, when people ask me nowadays, they're like, oh, what do you do for a living? Because that obviously defines us as people. Um, I used to say like, oh, I'm an adjunct professor, but now that I'm taking the semester off to have a baby, it's like I work in retail at an independent bookstore, like I'm a bookseller, and it feels like it's a continue to downgrade, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Um, but I've never felt comfortable saying I'm a writer because I don't have those like solid publications to my name until I'm at some place like AWP with other people who understand that writing is more than a hobby, but it takes a long time to become a career. So, how do you keep track of your submissions?
Well, as you know, I'm a spreadsheet girly.
Hmm.
So I have a spreadsheet and basically I have different tabs
Hmm.
for each thing I'm submitting. So
Hmm.
my first tab on my Google spreadsheet is a cover letter so that I could copy and paste it really easily.
You're
The
smart.
next the next one is opportunity, so stuff that's not writing, but I want to keep track of.
Hmm.
Then poetry, and then each one of my short stories has its own. And each one of these um, tabs has a list of magazines that I think this piece would be good to submit to. I include the pay because that's something I'm tracking as far as not because I want to make money, but because I want to join the Sci-Fi
Hmm.
Writers Guild, and in order to qualify, I need to make certain amount of money on the pieces I submit.
Hmm.
I include the word count that the magazine allows,
Hmm.
and then I have another section that the last column says when I submitted it and
Hmm.
or the like basically the current status. So on some
Yeah.
of them it's just rejected on this date, rejected on this date,
Right.
rejected on
Yeah.
this date.
You're so much more organized than me. And like, it's so funny in my like circle, I am the organized one. And I'm like, you guys don't even know Maddie. So I also have a spreadsheet and my spreadsheet has, I think, 4 columns. One is the journal I'm submitting to. Two is the name of the story I'm submitting. 3 is the date I submitted it, and 4 is the date I heard back from them. Oh, there's 5 columns because the fifth
Oh,
column is whether it was a yes or a no. And then I also have a no plus category, because we'll talk about this later, but there are different types of rejection letters.
yeah.
And so I keep track of that as well to know if I want to resubmit a different story to that journal. But that's the only thing I keep track of. Um, and so I really like your system that each of your short stories has their own tab, because there are times that I will look and be like, oh, this story has only ever been sent out to like one place. However, I do like my system in that I can look and see, like, oh, this journal has rejected these 3 different stories. Maybe I stop submitting to them. Like, they obviously are not my vibe.
Hmm.
Um, and then, I don't ever keep track of the word count and stuff because sometimes I'll submit to um, you know, one journal will have like their general short fiction, and then they'll have a contest for short fiction, and they all have different requirements.
Hmm.
So I don't keep track of that. And then again, I'm not trying to get into a guild. So pay me, don't pay me. It doesn't matter to me, luckily. Um, but I breaking into, I think, the sci-fi world versus the general fiction world is a lot more difficult. Um, the general fiction, I mean, just in general, I think the general fiction world is obviously difficult because it can have a lot of snobbery. But I think that the sci-fi fantasy world is difficult to break into because you guys have been undercut and undersold for so long that these journals have to take themselves extra seriously
Sure.
because the world does not take them seriously.
So contests
Hmm.
are another way you can get into the publishing industry.
Hmm.
And I have heard, as hasn't necessarily been our story, but I have
Hmm.
heard people getting discovered that way because
Hmm.
that's something that people pay attention to because it's an annual thing, something you
Hmm.
can submit to all the time. And it's very similar to the same process as how you submit to a journal, but usually there's a specific day you need to turn it into. Maybe there's a
Hmm.
specific theme or genre or a qualification like new
Hmm.
writers. I submitted to one for new poets.
Hmm.
And sometimes there's a little bit of a fee because it's a contest, so you're entering for the chance to win. And sometimes they ask you for additional information like an artist statement or something like that. But I think it's a good way because even if you don't get published, they usually publish a list of people who were finalists.
Hmm.
And so I think that gives you a little extra something, even if you don't get put, even if you don't win the contest, even if you don't place, you may be listed in a long list somewhere, which somebody could get access to and see your name. And it gets you a little bit of a
Prestige.
prestige, you can be
Yeah.
like, and that's something too you could
Hmm.
include in a cover letter for submissions.
Hmm.
Like I was a finalist in this contest. So that's
Yeah.
something that,
I feel like with contests too, because one of the things we didn't talk about yet is when submitting, most places, at least in my experience, have some kind of fee for submitting. Now there are a lot of places that will waive that fee for certain groups. But typically, for my journals at least, it's like $3 to $5 to submit. Like, not super exciting. For contests, though, it has been like $30 to submit. Like, it's a much bigger investment.
hmm,
However, the thing that I have found about contests is that you're more likely to get feedback as to why
it's
you were
true.
rejected. The one that we just submitted to the master's review novel excerpt
Yeah.
contest that we submit, I paid the extra money. So my submission fee, I think, was like $90. Like, it was a lot, but I got a full page back of editing notes from their team.
Oh,
That
yeah.
was really helpful for me. Now, that was an optional add-on, but you don't get that when you're just submitting to regular places.
True.
Generally, you get like a form letter rejection, but with contests, you can get more insight into what's working with your story and what isn't.
Yeah, I didn't do that for that particular contest, but I
Hmm.
have in the past. Specifically, that's something when I do a contest that is specifically for sci-fi. I will
Hmm.
do that. But the master's review wasn't that. They're not
No, it's
really
just
known for
yeah.
they weren't known for their sci-fi, so
Hmm.
I didn't know if I'd get the right kind of feedback. But I've
Yeah.
done that in the past,
Hmm.
and it was a let me tell you, it was a bit of an ego boost to read the
Nice.
feedback because like yes, there were like things they didn't like, but it was like overwhelmingly positive. They're
Hmm.
like, we really like this. We thought you did this really well,
Hmm.
but here's something that you can work on. And it made me feel like, okay, I'm not there is
Hmm.
something there. Like I do have talent that it's being seen by
Well,
an
it's
editor.
yeah, it's one of the reasons why I miss being in school is because the feedback that you get from other writers, while yes, sometimes it can be very, very harsh. For the most part, it's very constructive, like bullet point ways that you can improve your writing. And
Yes.
I appreciate that so much better than, sometimes you'll get stuff that was, it just didn't mesh with us or, it's just not a right fit. Whereas when you do contest feedback, you can get, this wording is awkward, or while your voice shines through here, it doesn't really shine through here. And, there's much more like concrete stuff that you can actually change and build on,
Yeah.
um, that I think is really beneficial to submitting to contests. And it's not going to happen to every contest,
No.
but it is much more likely to happen in a contest than it is just regular submission to a short literary journal.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's probably one of the biggest highlights of it because although it is more of an investment, but you are receiving feedback and
Hmm.
it's really hard when you're submitting because it's not like you're not like a stand-up comic who's standing on
Hmm.
a stage and like reading the audience. You have no idea. You're writing in a
Yeah.
vacuum and you just get form letters back. So you
Hmm.
don't know if it was like if it if it resonated at all or
Hmm.
if it's just a flop, but having the opportunity to have somebody read it and tell you like, oh hey, it feels like, oh, it's validating that you're
Hmm.
not writing
Yeah.
to just it's not like
Hmm.
being auto deleted in an inbox, which sometimes it feels like it might be.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I also think that submitting to contests, it's high risk, high reward. Of
Yes.
you are paying more money. However, if you win a contest, it's going to be a lot more, it's going to have more meaning behind it than just getting published in a journal. Um,
Yeah.
like I said, one of the only things that I've ever really gotten was an undergrad, and it was the Voices of the South Festival, which happens in Tallahassee, and it was the like first year that this festival was a thing. So I don't necessarily think, I constantly undercut myself. But part of me feels like the only reason I got second place is because it was the first year, not a whole lot of people submitted, whatever. Um, I see you
I
rolling your
just
eyes, but
why do you have to diminish every single one of your accomplishments? Like I just don't
because
understand. Be proud of yourself.
it's very difficult to do. But the point being, like, winning that contest, I then got to go and read my work in front of people, which was one of the first times that I had really gotten to do that. And it was very nerve-wracking, but it was also very exciting. And then it was also really cool. God, I cannot think of this man's last name. Did you watch Arrested Development?
No.
Okay, hold on. I have to Google this really quickly. Tony Hale. Um, so getting to do this contest, it was at the same festival that Tony Hale, who has been in Arrested Development, has been in Veep. He had a story, or I apologize, a book that was being published that he was promoting at the same time. So he was speaking at that festival. J.K. Simmons was also speaking at that festival. So while I didn't get to like meet these people or be in the same room as these people, I got to be a part of the same event as them. And like to know that people who were coming to see them happened to stumble upon my reading was really exciting. And so I feel like with contests, like I said, that high risk, high reward, like there's just so much, I don't know, more room for growth or room for promotion in
Hmm.
those types of settings. Um, and again, that was a festival contest, so like there was a physical part of it of going and reading your work. But I know with a lot of these other contests, it's just you could get published alongside of those same voices
Right.
that have a bit more experience than you. So it's almost like you get a part of the spotlight by standing next to them, you know?
Yeah. I also want to point out that there's a theme here with you talking
Hmm.
about contests. It seems like if you win a contest, you have the opportunity to meet a celebrity.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be great. Okay, I did stand in line to get Tony Hale's signature. And he signed the back of the story because I printed it out to read it. So he signed the back of my story. So that is very exciting,
Well, that's
actually.
that's so cool. What a cool
Yeah,
opportunity.
yeah, it was really fun. But again, it it happened back in 2015 at this point. So it's hard if you don't keep up with these things, if you don't continue to be persistent with your um, pursuit of submissions,
Yeah.
very quickly, just like with technology, very quickly these things I don't know. I don't want to say they diminish in value because being able to show somebody here is a publication is obviously important no matter what. Um, but if you're not consistently producing work, it's easy to get lost.
Yeah. And, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Okay, sports.
But it's true though. It is
It
it, it,
is,
it
yeah.
it's applicable here. Like you
Yeah.
just don't know. One last thing I would like to talk about a little
Hmm.
bit. If you are looking to start submitting somewhere, I do advise you to find opportunities that don't just fit your genre, but may be specific to you as a person. They have magazines that are specifically targeted for specific groups of people to help them find a place for their voice.
Yeah,
Um,
I find a lot of journals will say we are open to anybody who wants to submit. However, we are looking to promote specifically BIPOC community or like the LGBTQ plus community. I find is really right now
yeah.
um, they're trying to get a lot of support in those communities just because they've been so underserved in the past, especially when it comes to like literary commentary.
Yes. I recently found a place that I submitted to. I haven't heard back from them yet, but it's called Luna Station Quarterly, and it's specifically for women identified writers who write science fiction.
Oh,
So
very cool.
it's a very niche
Yeah.
thing. So I thought this might be a good place for me to find
Hmm.
my voice. So I think it's important if there's anything about you that makes you particularly unique, or
Hmm.
if you're a traditionally marginalized voice, I would definitely look into finding those types of opportunities.
Absolutely. And I think that that's important too, because people will get so bogged down in, well, this is the type of thing that I write, that that's all they will look for.
Right.
When in reality, journals are pretty flexible with what they publish. They want to just publish good writing. So if you are something outside their typical canon, but your writing speaks to them,
Yeah.
your chances are higher. So looking for places that want to promote you as a person are more likely
Yes.
to also want to promote your writing and your work.
Right. Because I mean, I might be more understanding of see where the place
Hmm.
is coming from. That's something I've been doing lately is trying to open it up a bit to not just submitting to strictly speculative magazines, to start
Hmm.
looking into places that accept genre fiction.
Hmm.
And they're like, we look for good writing. And sometimes it's annoying when they say that because they really don't mean science fiction or anything
Yep.
speculative. But,
Hmm.
I've never submitted someplace that didn't specifically say they weren't interested in speculative or wanted speculative and had
Hmm.
them be like, don't ever send us sci-fi again. No one's ever said that to me. So
Right. It's hard. The thing that's so funny is that while I mostly write contemporary fiction, a lot of my short stories fall into that realm of magical realism.
mhm,
And so it's always, uh, I don't know, it's hard to find a place where those fit because they're not quite speculative enough, but they're also not completely grounded in reality. And so by searching out those places who are looking to, in my case, promote women writers, or I always look for journals that are looking to promote new voices, particularly.
yes.
Like that's one that I look for is looking to promote like first time authors. That's where I am more likely to submit my work than looking for a specific like genre journal.
Yeah. That's a
Yeah.
good point. There are a lot
Mm,
of places that specifically are looking to help
hmm.
promote new writers because they
Yeah.
know how hard it is to be submitting around. So they want to find people that are struggling a bit to give them
Yep.
their get your foot in the door because I think people are more likely to take a
Hmm.
chance on you if you've been published somewhere else. That's not necessarily true,
Hmm.
but some places do they'd be more likely to take that chance if you already have something out there.
So, with this podcast, as we continue to build it, we're going to talk about a lot of different aspects of writing. Today we talked about more publication details. We're going to talk about aspects of craft. We're going to continue to talk about our personal journeys through all of this. But next week, we want to talk about how to build your writing community. This is something that both of us have really benefited from. And Maddie is an absolute expert in, as I joined her writing community through all of this. So we'll be talking about that next week for anybody interested in learning how to build their writing community. And hopefully through this podcast, we'll build our own like micro community.
Oh, that'd be nice. Yes.
Right? Maybe a macro community if,
A macro,
again, we
if we're
reach for the
lucky.
stars. Yeah.
I mean, I'd
But
be
yeah,
very happy if one person who isn't directly related to us listens to this podcast.
agreed. I'm Abigail,
And I'm Maddie, and this has been
two writers.
Many Wrongs.